There's no shortage of buy local slogans from around the world to bolster national economies, reduce imports, or simply to promote sustainability. Not surprisingly, Russia, a country facing international sanctions, has its own patriotic consumption drive, elevating the status of the Made in Russia label. President Putin stands firmly behind the slogan «Покупай русское» or «Buy Russian», and the passion for Russian has fired up plenty of followers.
За Россию! Покупайте русские телефоны, айфоны!
You can almost hear the existential cry to protect Russian products in the voice of musician Stas Paretsky in this clip, appealing to his compatriots to buy Russian iPhones.
Basically, the idea here is to create the impression that Russia can produce its own stuff domestically. This message plays very well with the government that wants to show that Russia is self-sufficient in the face of international isolation.
In our previous episode, we explored a concept of national identity embraced by the Kremlin, the so-called Russian Cultural Code, and its emblem, the traditional kokoshnik headdress. But the economy is less pliable than culture, where censorship rules. Here, market forces have the final say. Russians can buy anything they want, and they do.
You might not be able to procure American tomahawks, but if you're in Moscow, you can get the Louis Vuitton bag or a Chanel bag or cars like Rolls-Royce.
The push for domestic spending has been infused with patriotic ideology. It's in defiance of international sanctions that were imposed after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Everyone's suffering from labour shortages. There's not really any slack to be picked up. It could be that next year is the year that the wheels finally come off the militarised economy and there's no more juice to be squeezed out of it by reordering it.
After Western companies retreated as Moscow attacked Ukraine, the Russian economy began to shift. We explore how international sanctions reshaped production cycles and consumer habits, and we ask the million-dollar question: can Russia sustain its war effort indefinitely? I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, exploring the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Радио Tehran.
Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
The international community's condemnation of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine compelled many Western brands into retreat. Our military and economy expert Tim Bowler was tracking the moves of foreign companies in Russia's new reality.
The most obvious example is that McDonald's, Coca-Cola, they stopped selling or making goods in Russia in 2022, and they recently said that neither of them have any plans to return to do business. It was very good PR for them because they were under a great deal of pressure from shareholders to pull out. So they've been able to say, ha-ha, we're good guys here. We're not doing business in Russia.
The last day of McDonald's was marked on state TV too, including reports about traffic jams around drive-in stores in Moscow. The withdrawal of Western brands didn't stop Russian consumers from buying those goods. It just meant they started getting them from grey market resellers. To give us the story from the inside is Yevgeny Pudovkin, who works in our Russia team in Tbilisi.
You can still see plenty of familiar Western mass-market clothing brands being worn by the Russians, so H&M and Zara. Some of these brands are supplied through intermediaries directly to Russia, so consumers can buy it with a markup. And this stuff costs you like maybe 30% more because you have to pay some intermediary. Logistics have become more expensive, transactions have become more expensive. It's all taking a toll on the Russian economy. Many Russians do their shopping while traveling abroad, often to nearby places like Belarus or Kazakhstan, where Western brands are still present.
As the prices for imported goods climbed up, the Russian government began to steer consumers towards Made in Russia labels.
Government supports the Russian brands through fostering a so-called patriotic consumption.
Это все-таки согласовано и поддерживается государством. Присутствие наших брендов.
The Russian government offers grants and subsidies for projects that celebrate Russian heritage, like historical movies, folk festivals, what have you, or even it may support brands of clothing that produce like a suvorotka, which is traditional male garments, or kokoshniks. But this hasn't really translated into big consumer demand because the Russians, they just don't want things just because they're Russian. They have to be high quality. And the second constraint is purely economic. Russia's manufacturing base, at least as far as the civilian production is concerned, remains weak and domestic production costs are high. So, in a nutshell, making complex things inside Russia often turns out to be more expensive than just importing those complex goods from abroad.
How is the media treating this idea that Russia can be self-sufficient? How does it promote patriotic brand consumption, given the reality of the market forces still gravitating towards Western brands?
Basically, it's been the same story since 2014, and the key leitmotif is that Russia is moving towards self-sufficiency.
Выгодная покупка, где представлена продукция производителей из разных уголков России.
In a few years' time, Russian software makers can replace Western companies, but Western companies' software is still being used in Russia. State TV and the officials, they urge Russian companies to step up. They urge them to produce more. They urge them to make an effort.
Системам и гаджетам, в основном китайским и российским.
Russian companies have been successful in replacing Western goods and services in some parts of the economy, but the high-tech goods that Russia used to purchase from the West and from China in 2010, it is still buying those goods in 2025. And the speeches that officials make and that are being amplified by state TV channels, this is mostly used as a propaganda.
There's another phrase in circulation that's got presidential approval: importozamещение, or replacement of imports.
Программы импортозамещения на рынок у нас выходит большое количество российских новых брендов.
As a signal that, look, yes, there is the sanctions, and yes, there is this isolation from the West, but we can go it alone. We have partners in different parts of the world, and we can substitute all this Western stuff with our own or the stuff from our partners.
The pivot towards self-sufficiency hasn't lived up to expectations. But for the sake of optics at least, there's been a noticeable effort at Russification of the market, something we decided to call a retail rebrand.
It's actually been quite extensive. Everything from clothing to cars to restaurants has been rebranded.
А наши специалисты наращивают и становятся технологическими лидерами.
And even computers and laptops that Russians use, these are assembled in Russia from foreign imported components, but they're sold under local brands. They just assemble these PCs or laptops out of Chinese components, for example. And some big companies that have government connections have this obligation to purchase this Russian branded tag. They are taken off, but it's not omnipresent. Russia couldn't realistically replace the branding on smartphones, for example, so people still use iPhones and Xiaomis.
What happened to those Western companies that had to leave in a hurry? You know, brands like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Starbucks.
Basically, what happened is that Russian businessmen took over those Western assets and put them into use. McDonald's became Вкусная точка, which means tasty, that's it. And Coca-Cola turned into Dobry Cola, or to translate it, kind cola. But actually, if you look closely at those new brands, not much has actually changed beyond their naming. Dobry Cola logo still looks almost identical to the old traditional Coca-Cola, so it's the same red label, same white script. And at Вкусная точка, you can still get something called Big Special. It is basically the Russian copy of the Big Mac. Starbucks logo, they changed it from the kind of Western looked woman in kokoshnik, and this traditional values segment in Russian branding, it does exist. So there's brands that play on folk symbols, so on Soviet nostalgia.
What's behind this mimicry? Is it lack of imagination on behalf of Russian businesses, or is there something more to this?
The Russian owners, they understand that the majority of Russian consumers, they grew up in a global kind of market-driven economy, and they've used these Western standards. They're still on Instagram, they're still watching Hollywood movies, and they don't want to downgrade their consumer habits. So these new Russian owners stick with the same old recipe. The aesthetics of these new Russian brands, they correspond to the old style that the Western companies created.
The majority of Russian consumers may be too young to remember the Soviet days of self-sufficiency, but some of us do. The team making this podcast grew up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, or at least that's how we saw it. Krista in Hungary, I in Bulgaria. We occasionally compare notes on what we had and didn't have. Nivea cream, what everyone had.
The little metal, the
metal
flat
tin
metal
box.
one, yeah. I remember like once a year a small bottle of Nutella from the West, and that was my Nutella for a year, like teeny tiny spoonfuls from time to time.
You had to ration it.
Absolutely.
I remember for Christmas, the best thing I was waiting for Christmas was a Toblerone. That was just so much better than a Baikalche.
But talking of Christmas, of course, the smell of Christmas was the satsumas.
We
and
call them mandarins.
And the bananas, the very few times, or maybe the only time of the year.
The only time of the year I loved bananas because they would only come in the winter. And we actually thought they only grow in the winter. I was surprised you can find them any time of the year. What about clothes? Oh, jeans. Getting your hands on a pair of jeans.
I mean, we had them because we were the jolliest barak, as we were called.
Everything was the same. The clothes just weren't very interesting.
I remember the winter season started, and then if you walk into a shop and then you had 40 of this and then 35 of that, and that was it. And you chose either this or that, and there was
not much choice at
else.
all.
Yeah.
I remember Mum was telling me that when she was in high school, this must have been late 60s, her father used to travel on an oil tanker, and he brought her a pair of boots from Italy. They were beautiful burgundy boots. And she dared to wear them at school one day and promptly was turned away and told to go back and change into her bat shoes.
Speaking of burgundy shoes, on my very first trip to Russia, I actually wear a pair of red boots, and I was stopped every step of the way, and people wanted to buy a bite off my feet. The Soviet Union was tougher than us.
Another reminder of how ancient we are. The era of communism and bad shoes was replaced by the influx of those coveted Western goods. But 30-odd years later, many Russian consumers are now facing a new deficit of choice. Can Russia really become self-sufficient again?
You cannot put this genie back in the bottle, because once the Russians have acquired this taste for firms, for goods, you can't really kind of shut down the country completely. Okay, tomorrow you will have just one brand, like it used to be the case in the USSR, right? No, this is not going to cut it. This now will cause some consternation among the public. Russians can still travel. They can still bring stuff from other countries, basically unimpeded. When you look at the situation from the point of view of the Russian companies, you still have to compete with Western, with Asian brands for the Russian market. The consumers, they're still in sync with the global trends. They're not shut down in this kind of Russian environment and getting high on like kokoshniks and borschts and whatever.
You gave me a giggle there with getting high on kokoshniks and borscht. But let's stay with consumers for a moment who are clearly voting with their wallets. Where do they shop?
These changes that we see on the Russian markets, they have mostly affected the middle segment of the market. Because if you look at population who are just basically trying to make their ends meet, they used to buy no branded stuff from Turkey or from China, and they're still available. They don't hunt for Louis Vuitton bag. They don't care about brands. They don't actually much care about fashion. And also, if you look at the Russian reach, their consumer habits haven't changed a bit because they still have access to Western cars, to Western clothing as well. You might not be able to procure American Tomahawks or any industrial defense gear, of course, but if you're in Moscow and you have a few $1,000s, you can get the delivery of a Louis Vuitton bag or Chanel bag or whatever you want. The same goes for cars like Rolls-Royce. They'll get it delivered to you probably via countries like Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan.
The president himself seems to have a taste for Western luxury. One puffer jacket he sported at a big pro-war rally a couple of years ago earned him scorn by the tabloid press abroad. The jacket was said to be worth more than $10,000.
The middle segment is where all the changes are noticeable. Someone who is a middle-class Russian, he sees, for example, H&M, which now costs maybe 50% more, and he sees all these emerging Russian companies who try to kind of mimic Western-style brands, and they look stylish. Lots of Russians, they say, well, why would I pay more if I can get these new Russian-branded things? They're still quite good. And Russian jewelry producers, Russian fashion designers, they actually exist in this. And these companies see their sales go up, definitely.
Linked up on TV with a regional governor recently, the president inquired about the origin of his suit and appeared satisfied when he got the right answer. Of course, all of it is Russian-made.
У вас костюмчик-то отечественного производства?
Из отечественного производства.
Russia is a country of vast natural and human resources. What does it produce on its own, besides suits for politicians?
Russia is already producing petrochemicals, it is producing cars, it is producing agricultural goods. It can basically feed its population.
Является одним из главных поставщиков продовольствия на глобальный рынок.
And it actually can produce some basic complex goods like airplanes, which few countries can. What Russia tries to do is to specialize in particular things like energy, like petrochemicals, like agriculture, right? And it tries to invest its money strategically. It concentrates on several industries. It does that because of the experience of the Soviet Union. It produced everything in-house, but at a very poor quality.
Russian companies have shown themselves to be nimble in order to attract customers. But let's turn our attention to those Western companies who had to abandon their assets in Russia for little or no compensation, for no fault of their own.
It has not really had much of an effect on their bottom line because Russia was not a huge market for them. The one company that's different is Pepsi. Pepsi was always much more invested in Russia than its rival Coca-Cola. It employs around 60,000 workers in Russia.
Pepsi также заявила об уходе с российского рынка. В бренд входят 7-Up, Mirinda, Chips Ahoy.
Now Pepsi's been able to say, well, we're stopping making branded soft drinks in Russia. But those factories are still producing soft drinks. They've just been called other names, Everest and Frustyle, for the Russian market. So for Pepsi, it's been a much more difficult decision because, of course, if you pull out of Russia, then you face punitive charges in leaving because the Russians aren't letting Western firms pull out scot-free. You have to sell off your assets at fire sale levels, so you lose money. Starbucks had 130 coffee shops across Russia. It basically said, OK, we'll ditch them. But it didn't cost it that much money. For Pepsi, it would have been much, much more significant loss.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. The departure of Western companies left more space for others to step into. And here comes a country that stands out for its support – China.
Свято место пусто не бывает, заявили конкуренты. Восточная Азия как будто ждала такого.
For example, if you look at woodworking machinery, the large part of this market was occupied by Europe. Now it's almost exclusively China. Chinese cars are making up about half of the sales on the Russian market, which is huge, and which is the share that the Western cars used to have. Another kind of interesting layer to this whole rebranding story is linked to sanctions, because Russia still doesn't have the technology to make high-end products. But here is the thing, Chinese companies, they don't want to attract too much Western scrutiny or to risk secondary sanctions. They sell Chinese cars under Russian brand names.
Китайские, на данный момент неплохо.
Think Lada, Volga, Moskvich. These are old names, but now they come with a new twist.
One example is Moskvich. On paper, it's Russian traditional car, but in reality, its components are being sourced from China. This is a kind of workaround that allows Chinese firms not to attract too much attention and thereby reduce their chances of being sanctioned by the West. Another part of the story is that Russian firms also sometimes legally import Chinese equipment and then slap the Russian label onto it to create the impression that Russia can produce its own stuff domestically. This message plays very well with the government that wants to show that Russia is self-sufficient in the face of international isolation. Yeah, you can see it being mentioned in the media where some company just buys Chinese stuff and try to portray it as its own production to kind of get credibility and to get recognition and possibly some financial rewards from the government.
How is the media treating China, propping up the Russian economy? And how is that being talked about? Because this jars with the idea of Russian superiority, whether it's moral or otherwise, with the idea of the big brother saving Russia. That's a country in need, and both of them want to lead the global south. So what's this relationship like in the eyes of the Russian media?
They portray it as a friendship and as a partnership of equals. Of course, Russia doesn't want to mention that China is a bigger partner and is a bigger economy. What Russian TV and the Russian officials are saying is that this partnership doesn't have any political strings attached.
Российский премьер встретился с председателем Китая Си Цзиньпином и премьером Ли Цаном.
It's a win-win for everyone, and it is strictly business. On top of that, there is some thin political layer which saying, look, China, like Russia, it has some grievances with the US, sanctions with the US, heavy-handed approach to political issues and to economic, to trade issues. Russia and China have same interests.
Великими державами мы придаем большое значение развитию двусторонних отношений.
It's not just Russia who is kind of isolated and this mad Russian bear who just goes around and takes in other countries' territories. No, look, it's not just Russia. It's China, it's Brazil. Nobody is pleased with what the US is doing, and we have these partners, and we're cooperating with them, and everything is good. We have the second largest economy who wants to trade with us, and we have all these economies across the world who still want to have good relations with Russia.
Сейчас здесь собрались представители уже около 100 государств.
So that's the spin they're putting on it, and they don't so much emphasize China's role as a savior of Russia. They want to present this Russia-China partnership as being able and being willing to support each other.
State media in Russia reflects the official line and has an upbeat tone of defiance in the face of tough challenges. But you also find sobering takes on the state of the economy. The BBC's Russia editor Steve Rosenberg picked up on a few gloomy newspaper reports a couple of weeks ago, starting with Moskovsky Komsomolets.
The Russian car market is on the way to becoming like Cuba or the USSR. The average price of a new car in Russia has reached 3.43 million rubles. That's around $42,000, an absolute record. The pool of cars in the country is aging, like in Cuba after the break in relations with America. The rising price of coffee is also making headlines here with this prediction. Soon, Russians will go back to the kind of cheap coffee substitutes from Soviet times. For example, chicory or a coffee drink made out of rye. Kommersant. Air freight companies see a risk of aircraft being grounded and companies leaving the market.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's address the elephant in the room. If you ask Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the only thing that could bring Russia to its knees and onto the path of peace is hard-hitting sanctions. The sanctions that matter are those targeting Russian oil and gas, by far the biggest earner for the country.
Russia cannot sell its oil and gas to Europe, so it has to send it a longer way to China and to India. The revenue that Russia gets from oil and gas sales abroad took a hit, obviously.
Despite some sanctions, Russia found a way to continue exporting its energy resources, albeit at a lower price. But now this might have come under threat with the introduction of a new round of sanctions in October, explicitly against energy giants Rosneft and Lukoil. It's too early to say whether this will be a game changer, but it's not looking good for Russia.
They're targeting Russia's two biggest energy firms that export 3 million barrels of oil a day. Rosneft alone is producing nearly half of Russian oil, makes up about 6% of global output. We're beginning to see some effect. India and China, which up until now have been buying Russian oil and gas products, are beginning to think, well, we too could suffer from sanctions if we are excluded from the SWIFT banking system, which in effect the US controls. That would have huge consequences for our own economy. India is already under pressure from the US with tariffs, some of which have been imposed because of its purchases of Russian energy. If that's cut off, then Russia will have a serious problem.
The latest sanctions have also put a spotlight on the shadow fleet that transports Russian oil to willing buyers.
The first thing Russia did when war was declared was they bought up lots of very old oil tankers, several hundred of them. Tankers that Western firms probably wouldn't use. They are underinsured. They're not looked after very well. And Russia's been using these through middlemen, through shady ownerships, to, in effect, sell oil around the globe.
Many or most are floating rust buckets. The shadow fleet is an accident waiting to happen.
The reaction is as strong as it can be according to the rule-based order.
But the EU is now targeting specifically at least 117 of these tankers. That's been a very successful way Russia has been able to counter the effects of sanctions. But right now we're seeing a sea change, if you'll forgive the pun.
Moscow's wealth has largely been fueled by the energy giants. Foreign oil companies, too, were deep in that mix for decades in far-flung corners of Russia.
Energy companies accept a higher risk because they have to go where the resources are, and often they're in places where you might have undemocratic regimes or unstable regimes. So let's look at BP, for instance. BP had a huge stake in the Russian oil giant Rosneft, the combination of 3 decades of operating in Russia. Rosneft accounted for around half of BP's oil and gas reserves and a third of its production. So when BP pulled out and basically abandoned its stake, it cost it some $25 billion. That's a huge hit on your bottom line. However, put that in context, we saw surges in global energy prices that supercharged BP's profits. And in 2022, they were the highest ever in its corporate history, at $27 billion. So even though BP had a huge hit, because of the movement of oil prices, gas prices, they were able to ride it out. If we look at the biggest 5 listed oil companies in the world, they've made profits of more than $380 billion since the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent rise in energy bills. The Big Five's profits jumped 125% the year Russia invaded Ukraine.
These eye-watering profits did not go down well with some Western consumers.
What we saw on the back of those profits, with public outrage over what many saw as wartime profiteering, ultimately, of course, it's the consumers in those countries that ended up paying. Many European governments have been very loath to fully implement sanctions on oil or gas because they are worried about the negative impact of that on their own economies. In Europe, of course, Hungary, Slovakia are the two obvious examples of countries that have said, no, our economies can't afford not to have Russian energy. And in many cases, other countries have been similarly very careful about cutting off their nose to spite their face, because the cost to their own domestic economy could be too high.
And the Russians know this. Here's President Putin spelling it out.
Let us imagine the worst nightmare, that the Russian oil production is squeezed out of the world market. The prices will get sky high immediately. Is this in the interest of those countries that are already unwell? Are they going to look for trouble?
The West has failed to send the Russian economy in a knockout with one punch. What the West is doing is basically eroding the profits that Russian energy companies are making.
The sanctions have had a limited effect for a variety of reasons. Russia reorganized its economy to serve the war, which has created demand for weapons, and that has fueled economic growth.
In the first year of the war, Russia's economy shrank by a couple of percent. But then the economy actually grew as the Kremlin restructured the economy around military production, and there was this huge state demand for equipment, tanks, shells, guns. So the economy grew by 3.5% in 23 and 4% in 24 due to all this state spending. Despite that, the sanctions have had damaged the economy. I mean, the central bank put up interest rates. They peaked at 21% last year. They're now down to around 16%. The bank's having to juggle trying to control inflation and not strangle the economy. Everyone's suffering from labour shortages. There's not really any slack to be picked up. It could be that next year is the year that the wheels finally come off the militarised economy and there's no more juice to be squeezed out of it by reordering it.
Despite the initial sanctions, the economy was revitalised thanks to the war machine. But this story is not yet over. Revenue from oil and gas dropped by 1/5 so far this year, according to official data quoted by the Kommersant newspaper. And this is before the latest sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil came into effect. So the question on everyone's lips is, how long can Russia keep the war effort going?
Can Russia sustain its war effort indefinitely? The answer is yes, because Russia still sells enough energy to make a hefty profit. The Russian economy haven't taken a hit that would bring the whole facade of the economy down. That's not even remotely the case. The money that Russia sends to war are still below 10% of its GDP, which compares to about 40% of the GDP that Ukraine spends to war. Of course, this war is hurting Russian economy, it is bleeding, but the damage is not catastrophic. In a nutshell, things are bad, but they're not bad enough to make Russia stop.
That's the Kremlin's bet, that it can have a forever war. And it may be that it will be able to juggle the competing pressures of inflation and a lack of excess and a lack of workers to... But it's also quite possible that next year is a year that the economy sinks into stagflation. Inflation remains high, and that means having high interest rates, but those choke off economic growth because it's too expensive to borrow and invest.
When you erode this surplus that Russia is getting with its energy trade, if the damage will be felt across different sectors, will be felt by the population, that will make Russia reconsider its foreign policy. You may have a chance of Russian leadership being worn down by these expenses and to some extent becoming more pliable to negotiations, because unlike Ukraine, this war for Russia is not existential, even though its leadership says it is.
Thank you to our experts Yevgeny Pudovkin and Tim Bowler. Sound mix was by Nigel Dix. The production team, Krista Shattery, and me, Krasiva Novatwig. And if you found this episode interesting, check out our back catalogue. We have many other episodes on Russia specifically, but also covering many other parts of the world.